Ever walk past a university, all those big buildings, and wonder, how'd this all start?
Yeah.
Today, we're diving into the history of universities, and trust me, it's way more interesting than you might think. We're using Wikipedia's article on university as our guide.
Sounds like a plan.
So ready to uncover the origins of these academic giants.
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so picture this. It's the year 1088.
1088. Wow, that's going back a bit.
Right. We're talking medieval times here. And in the bustling city of Bologna, Italy, something remarkable is happening.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's going on in Bologna?
Students hungry for knowledge are basically pooling their money together
To pay for their studies?
to hire teachers directly. It was a completely student-led approach to education.
Wow, talk about taking charge of your education. That's amazing.
Right. They were like, we want to learn about Roman law, specifically ius gentium, the law of nations, and we're willing to pay for the best. And thus, the University of Bologna, the very first university, was born.
The very first. So no grand libraries or ivy-covered walls just yet?
Nope. Just a bunch of determined students and their hired professors, but their actions had a ripple effect throughout history, shaping the very idea of a university.
It really makes you think about the power of collective action. But why Roman law? Why not, say, knightly training or something more medieval?
That's a great question, and it makes perfect sense when you consider the historical context. This was a time of booming towns, burgeoning trade, and the rise of guilds. They needed a new legal framework for a changing world.
So universities weren't just ivory towers. They were addressing real-world needs from the very beginning.
Precisely. It's like a medieval version of getting the right qualifications for a hot new career path. But here's where it gets even more interesting. These rebellious students in Bologna hiring their own teachers.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like academic freedom, doesn't it?
It's incredible, isn't it? Bologna, the very first university, essentially enshrined this principle with the Constitutio Habita. It guaranteed safe passage for traveling scholars, allowing them to pursue knowledge without fear of persecution.
Wait, are you telling me that the concept of academic freedom, something we often take for granted today, can be traced back to a bunch of medieval students in Italy?
It's true. And their actions had a profound impact on the evolution of universities, fostering a culture of intellectual exploration and debate that continues to this day. But the story doesn't end there.
There's always more to the story, isn't there? Okay, what happened next?
Well, the university scene wasn't exactly a uniform landscape. The experience of a student in, say, Paris would be drastically different from their counterpart in Bologna.
Oh, how so?
Imagine yourself a scholar in the sunny South. Universities like Bologna and Salerno were teeming with aspiring lawyers and physicians.
Makes sense, given the rise of city-states and, well, the need for healthcare is pretty universal, right?
Exactly. But now, transport yourself north to the likes of Paris, Oxford, or Heidelberg.
Okay, I'm there. What's the vibe?
Here, the atmosphere crackled with debates on theology, philosophy, and the arts.
So instead of dissecting legal texts, they were dissecting Aristotle and debating the finer points of religious doctrine.
You've got it. The universities of the North and South, while sharing a common root, developed distinct flavors reflecting the social and intellectual needs of their respective regions.
Fascinating. So we have these two distinct flavors of universities emerging in medieval Europe. But why such a stark contrast? Was it just a simple case of different strokes for different folks?
It ran much deeper than that. You see, these regional differences weren't just about curriculum. They extended to the very power dynamics within these institutions.
Okay, now we're talking about who calls the shots. Students or faculty? Always a relevant debate, even today.
While Bologna thrived on its student-led model up north, in Paris, it was the faculty who reigned supreme. This difference in governance models, fascinatingly enough, continues to echo in universities today.
It's like we're hardwired with these echoes of the past. But speaking of echoes, this next bit really blew my mind. Are you ready for this?
Always up for a good historical twist. Lay it on me.
Okay, so get this. Remember those medieval guilds we talked about earlier? Those ancient professional organizations. They're still with us today, hiding in plain sight in our modern universities.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It's a direct line from the craftsmen and merchants of the Middle Ages to the hallowed halls of academia.
I'm completely lost. Explain it to me like I'm a student in one of those medieval universities.
Think about it this way. Most guilds faded away as capitalism took over because they controlled trade and craft. Universities, however, were essentially guilds of knowledge, and that, my friend, is a powerful thing to control. They persisted, adapted, and in a way, they're still thriving on that same principle today.
Universities, the guilds that survived capitalism. Now that's an idea I need to sit with for a moment.
Me too. But before we get too lost in thought, I think we have a lot more ground to cover in the history of universities.
Right, absolutely. The story takes some fascinating turns, especially as we enter the Renaissance and the dawn of a new era of thinking,
Humanism.
which I have a feeling will lead us to a whole other set of aha moments. But we'll save those for part 2 of our deep dive. Don't go anywhere.
And we're back, diving even deeper into the fascinating world of universities. Before the break, we were talking about how universities are kind of like the guilds that survive capitalism, holding on to the power of knowledge. It's a powerful image, right?
It really is. And it highlights how those medieval origins still resonate today and how universities function, how they wield influence.
It's making me look at my alma mater's alumni association in a whole new light, that's for sure. But let's not get sidetracked too much by secret societies yet. We left off on the cusp of the Renaissance and the rise of humanism. What was it about this era that shook things up in the academic world?
Imagine a world where knowledge was largely viewed through the lens of religious dogma. Humanism dared to challenge that.
So less about accepting things at face value, more about asking, hey, what else is out there?
Exactly. It was about engaging with the world in a whole new way. Humanist scholars dove back into classical Greek and Roman texts, rediscovering philosophy, art, and a whole lot of critical thinking along the way.
It's like they hit the refresh button on centuries of accepted knowledge. Were universities quick to embrace this shift, or did they put up a fight?
Let's just say that change didn't happen overnight. But the impact of humanism was undeniable. Gradually, it transformed what was taught in universities and how it was taught. This era marked the birth of the humanities as we know them today.
That's incredible. Who knew that our modern-day university departments could trace their roots back to this Renaissance-era intellectual revolution?
It really highlights the long-lasting impact of these seismic shifts in thinking. And speaking of seismic shifts, the humanist emphasis on critical thinking and exploration set the stage for what we now call the scientific revolution.
Ah, yes, the era of Copernicus, Galileo, and a whole lot of questioning about the universe. Given what we've learned about universities so far, I can already imagine some tension brewing between tradition and groundbreaking discoveries. Am I right?
You're spot on. The relationship between universities and the scientific revolution was complex, a fascinating mix of progress and pushback. It wasn't a clean break from the past, but rather a messy, often contradictory process of adaptation and discovery.
Okay, walk me through this. Were universities the ones championing scientific breakthroughs, or were they trying to hold back the tide of change?
The answer, as with most things in history, is a bit of both. On one hand, universities were initially slow to embrace the radical new ideas emerging from the scientific revolution. These were institutions steeped in tradition, after all. Change wasn't always easy.
So they were more likely to cling to old theories than embrace radical new ones.
To some extent, yes. But here's where it gets interesting. Many of the key figures driving the scientific revolution were themselves products of the university system.
Yeah?
They received their foundational training at these very institutions.
Hold on a minute. So universities were both hesitant to embrace new scientific thought, and yet they were churning out the very minds that were revolutionizing science.
Exactly. It's a paradox, isn't it? It really makes you think about the role of institutions in general. How do they balance preserving tradition while also fostering innovation? It's a question that's still relevant today, not just in academia, but in any field that's grappling with change and progress.
It's that classic tension between sticking with what you know and daring to venture into the unknown. But before we get too philosophical here, let's bring our deep dive into the modern era. Because let's face it, universities today look a lot different than they did back in the days of medieval Bologna, right?
You're telling me we've come a long way from students pooling their pennies to hire a professor.
No kidding. I mean, I don't remember having to bargain with my professors over their salaries, although come to think of it.
Let's save that story for another time. The point is, the landscape of higher education today is vastly different and far more diverse. We've been talking about the university as this single entity, but the reality is much more multifaceted.
Right. We're talking about everything from small liberal arts colleges to massive public research institutions, from online platforms to centuries-old campuses with more tradition than you can shake a mortarboard at.
You've got it. And they're all funded in vastly different ways, with varying levels of access and affordability. It makes you realize that the very definition of what constitutes a university has become incredibly diverse and nuanced.
It's a far cry from those early days in Bologna. But with all these changes, with all this diversity, is there still a common thread that connects that first university to the vast and varied world of higher education today?
That's a question that a landmark study on higher education, known as the Robbins Report, attempted to answer. And what they concluded is both insightful and incredibly relevant to our conversation.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did the Robbins Report have to say about the core purpose of a university?
It argued that despite all the variations, universities should strive to produce not just specialists, but cultivated men and women. In other words, individuals who are not only knowledgeable in their chosen fields, but also equipped with the critical thinking skills, adaptability, and broad-mindedness to navigate a complex and ever-changing world.
Cultivated men and women. It's a phrase that feels both timeless and incredibly relevant to the challenges we face today.
Absolutely. And it begs the question, in an age of information overload, of rapidly evolving technologies and increasing societal complexity, how do we ensure that universities can actually deliver on this vision? That's something we'll be exploring as we delve into the future of these institutions.
Okay, now you've really got me thinking. Stay tuned, listeners, because this deep dive is about to get even more thought-provoking. We'll be right back after a quick break.
And we're back for the final leg of our deep dive into the world of universities. It's been quite a journey, from those medieval classrooms to, well, the ones we find ourselves in today, albeit maybe with less Roman law and more, Wi-Fi.
And through it all, that question of purpose keeps popping up, right? What are universities for in this day and age?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Especially now when it feels like the world's changing faster than ever.
Exactly. Like we were just talking about the Robbins Report and that whole idea of universities producing cultivated men and women.
Which, by the way, I love that phrase. So elegant, so aspirational. But what does that even look like in practice in 2024 with all the complexities we're facing? Right. It's not just about churning out specialists anymore, is it? I mean, the half-life of knowledge these days feels about 5 minutes long.
Tell me about it. I swear, every time I log onto Twitter, there's a new skill I'm supposed to be terrified of not having.
Exactly. So it's less about what you know at this moment and more about how you adapt, how you keep learning and growing. It's about critical thinking, problem solving, those sorts of things.
So less memorizing facts and figures, more like building a mental toolkit for navigating a world that's constantly throwing curveballs.
Precisely. And that's where universities need to adapt too, right?
Mm.
The traditional model, lectures, textbooks, it's not enough anymore.
You think those medieval students in Bologna would have been cool with just like a syllabus and a reading list? No way. They were out there shaping their own education.
They were active participants. And that's the spirit we need to recapture, I think. That drive to question, to explore, to not just consume knowledge, but to create it.
And that's where things get really exciting, right? Because we're seeing those shifts happening, albeit maybe not as quickly or dramatically as some would like.
Absolutely. Online learning, interdisciplinary studies, a greater focus on critical thinking. These are all signs that universities are evolving, even if it's messy and uneven.
It's like we're witnessing the birth pangs of a whole new era for higher education.
Exactly. And who knows what the university of the future will look like. But if there's one thing our deep dive has shown us, it's that universities have this incredible capacity for reinvention.
They've weathered revolutions, both literal and figurative. They've adapted to changing social norms, economic realities, technological advancements. They've gone from catering to a select few to, in theory at least, opening their doors to the world.
And through it all, that fundamental purpose, that pursuit of knowledge, of cultivating curious and engaged minds, it's persisted.
It's kind of inspiring when you think about it that way, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating, complex, and ever-evolving world of universities. We hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as we have.
And that you'll keep those questions coming, those minds buzzing, because learning, like the history of universities, is a journey without a final destination.
Beautifully said. From both of us here at The Deep Dive, thanks for listening.